Hi, welcome to the deep dive on sex in America. There's no way to make that sound not naughty. I'm Hanna Rosin. I am going to guide you through this conversation today. And here is the basic idea that we're going to explore. There's a feeling in America right now that sex is everywhere, that we're cool with it in any form that it presents itself, that it's on our phones, that it's on our computer screens, that we've reached an era of maximum sexual liberation, and yet there is a lingering and profound discomfort around sex in many forms, a sense that it's dangerous, a sense that we're not that comfortable with it, that it's happening in the wrong way. So we're going to talk about that contradiction in this moment, how we got here. So historically, how did we get here? What things have changed and what things haven't changed? And then we're also going to talk about why the lingering discomfort, what does it mean, and what forms it's taking right now. We have a lot of fabulous panelists coming up in this hour and some. And we're going to start with the person at my right, Eric Berkowitz. He's a human rights and asylum lawyer. He's a journalist and author of 2 books on the interplay of sex and the law, The Boundaries of Desire, which is a fabulous book, which I finished reading before coming here, which is chock full of the most fascinating historical examples you will ever read, and also Sex and Punishment, 4,000 Years of Judging Desire. Eric is going to start us off for the first 10 minutes with essentially a history lesson about sex and the efforts to repress it. So, Eric, take it away.
Thank you. Well, as Betty Davis said, buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be a really bumpy ride. I'm going to give just a little bit of where we were. Stepping back, not all the way, but to the beginning of the last century, we're going to be going back and forth a bit. Stepping first into the home and into marriage, the whole idea of what sort of sex was allowed or what sort of sex was had was completely different, really, than the way that we feel now. Essentially, a woman had no volition or agency at all. She was sort of a holdover piece of property as traditionally held by the law. And the paramount example of that is men were permitted to violently rape their wives. In fact, the whole idea of a man raping his wife, the law had no idea that that could happen. It didn't exist. When a woman said, "I do" at the altar, she was really held to say, "You can," and forever, and with violence if you want. The idea of the sanctity of the home, the idea of the law not wanting to step inside the home and fix any bits of violence or any oppression, that was sacrosanct. And it took a whole lot of work by a lot of very selfless feminist advocates and others to get that rule thrown out. In fact, they really weren't thrown out entirely until the early 90s, okay? With lawmakers still saying, "Oh, that's going too far, we're stepping inside the home, marriage is sacred," etc. Adultery, a century ago, was still a court action against women and their paramours. Whether the woman wanted it or not didn't matter. According to a British commentator, a woman was no more capable than a horse of consenting to adultery.
Can you give an example of one of those 90s laws? Because they were really interesting. The things that lingered, like the court cases, one of the court cases that lingered where the courts ruled that the courts had no business interfering in people's homes. That was very interesting examples in the book.
Going back to the beginning?
No, just one from the more modern era.
Oh, well, it's still the case. It still is very, very, I can't really think of one from the
Okay, go ahead. From the 90s. I was thinking of the southern states in the 90s where there were laws on the books, but
okay.
Anyway, keep going.
But, there's still the holdover, and we still hear it all the time, that the home is sacred. The problem is what's going on in the home when it's not so nice, it shouldn't be quite so sacred. At the same time, women were also seen as not being capable of taking on challenges outside the home. If they engaged in voting, there was the suffragette movement. If they engaged in educational pursuits, professional, it was seen to rot their womb. They would be regressing and lose their role, which is what God had intended for them, which is stay home, have kids with their husbands, and that's it. Women who pursued sex either for money or for fun were considered at that point to be feeble-minded. In fact, the first institution for sexual psychopaths set up by the Rockefellers focused on prostitutes. The hypersexuality, which was always pinned to dark-skinned women and women of color, was seen as a species of mental illness. And as eugenics began to kick in, we began to sterilize them. And tens of thousands of women, mostly of color, were sterilized for unhealthy sexual appetites. In fact, Sweden really got into that. 60,000 women were sterilized for the good of the human race for unhealthy sexual appetites. The poor we still have this subject to moral scolds. The notion of a woman, as black women began to tap into the welfare system more and more throughout the century, having kids while unmarried was cause for having your benefits cut off. So a woman's body had a price. She was still seen as a prostitute. If she had sex, then she was cut off. In fact, there were raids, lots and lots of raids on women's houses. In the 60s, in fact, if you find a cigar, a man's shoes or something, the benefits were cut off. So while Mad Men and the sexual revolution was happening and white women were taking the pill and upper class women were exploring that, for women of color, not the same thing.
He has a fascinating case in his book of a woman who is, the judge said she could not have custody of her children in a divorce suit because she had a boyfriend. So the judge made her choose, essentially, if she brought the boyfriend home or if she slept with anyone, then the children wouldn't be in her custody.
It was unbelievable. It was right outside my home in San Francisco. She had a boyfriend. The judge thought that was a bad thing. And he made her promise on the record, you aren't going to have him around, are you? And she finally won, but a woman without resources couldn't. We still see women who are sexual, poor women are sexual as being somehow immoral. We can't forget Robert Byrd, the senator, from calling them welfare chiselers, breeders, etc. But somewhere, at least for women with some money and from the middle and upper classes, somewhere around the 1960s, a fulfilling sexual life began to be seen as an element of a life well lived. This is the first time ever that was seen. Men, different standards. But facilitated by the birth control pill, facilitated by penicillin, women were able to finally make choices of marriages based on attraction, based on a whole other bunch of criteria than merely a meal ticket. And they didn't have to get married. And a lot of people stopped getting married. The marriage rates dropped precipitously with the pill. And then we had to go back and rethink marriage in the law. And it took none other than tough guy actor Lee Marvin and his wife, his girlfriend, Michelle Triol, to get that changed. Until 1980, women who lived with men were seen as a subspecies of prostitute. There was no protection for them. It was called a meretricious relationship, which is a nice long word meaning prostitute. And so Lee Marvin kicked her out of the house, wouldn't give her any money. It went through the courts. Finally, women who are not married, who are having even loving relationships long term, were seen as something closer to a wife and something less than a prostitute. Pornography. We got to keep on moving here. A century ago, of course, pornography was suppressed heavily. A lot of colorful characters. This knucklehead Anthony Comstock, who was a Brooklyn dry goods salesman who found his métier interfering with the mail. That's a whole thing. But what was included in pornography? It wasn't just sexual stuff. It was birth control information. Birth control information, science textbooks, physiology textbooks were suppressed as hardcore porno. And Margaret Sanger, the hero, a lot of her battles with Anthony Comstock, they were blood enemies, were really built around whether the information that she was distributing was obscene. So it took, again, a long, hard fight to rethink that, to rethink what is acceptable, and birth control, of course, is now, still, it's available, but there are restrictions, et cetera. Pornography still remains, even though it's saturation, it still remains a big, big issue. Does it lead to rape? Does it suppress rape? Dan Savage and I were just talking about that a couple minutes ago. He informed me, I didn't know this, that when pornography becomes available, rates of rape go down. A lot of people believe that it drives rape. There's been an unholy alliance between the far right and the far left in suppressing porno as being an element of a sexual culture gone way, way too far. We still have obscenity laws. They're selectively enforced against people that we don't really want around. For example, I've got a guy in Florida who ran a porno site out of his apartment, out of his laptop, geared towards soldiers in Afghanistan. And he created kind of a chat situation, and when the soldiers began to post pictures of beheaded Iraqi and Afghani kids, then it was a pornography, obscenity action against him that shut him down, using the local standards of Florida where he lived. Even though the whole local standards thing is blown away completely by the internet, there is no more local anything. We still keep that, and really the chief locus of obscenity prosecutions happens in states like Florida, where there's a very high pornography consumption. Homosexuality, we don't need to learn what's happened in the last few years. The thing that I want to bring up is about a century ago, it was turned into a sickness rather than a sin. And beware the cures. So we now have a situation in which homosexual behavior is legal, but parents can still put their kids through gay cures, can still change the gender identity of their kids through surgery. Those are going to be, I think, some of the key issues coming up.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That's our historical.
I think I'll head down.
That was a century in 10 minutes, so that was very impressive. So Eric is going to head down. We're going to bring a new crew up, but you will have a chance to ask him questions after this next panel. So I'm going to start introducing them as they get mic'd. This is Eric Klinenberg. He's a professor of sociology at NYU. He's the author of Going Solo, The Extraordinary Rise and Surprising Appeal of Living Alone. He's also the co-author with Aziz Ansari of Modern Romance, a truly hilarious book. He does so many things, and he's very funny. Maybe he'll be funny for us today. No, you are very funny.
Aziz is definitely very funny.
Yes.
That, by the way, I have to say, I'm not on. Now, can you hear me? I feel like we need humor because, Eric, that was really interesting, but that was the most depressing beginning to a conversation about sex. Like, I came in here, I was like, I've lost all my interest in sex.
What do you mean? We got the
I was
pill.
going to the National Security Conference instead to cheer myself up.
There was moments of great liberation in that. Liberation, absolutely. We got a little pill, penicillin, in there. The women, I felt, were moving rapidly forward in those 10 minutes.
Thank
you know, exactly.
I feel like penicillin does something for you that it doesn't do for me.
Well, I just, in my mind, I was like putting myself as woman 100 years ago to woman today. It's, yay.
It gets better.
It gets better, exactly.
In my mind, I never put myself in women.
You don't? Okay, well, the gays, it also got better for the gays in
Ladies
that.
and gentlemen, it's going to be different from now on.
Less depressing.
Oh boy, Emily Bazelon. Hi, Emily. She is a writer at the New York Times Magazine. She recently had a cover story about sex work and whether we should legalize it. We are going to talk about that. It was a wonderful story. She's the author of Sticks and Stones, Defeating the Culture of Bullying, Rediscovering the Power of Character and Empathy. And she's also a co-host on Slate's Political Gabfest. And then we have Dan Savage. I was just pausing for that, and you guys gave it to me. That's a good audience. Okay. Dan writes the sex advice column Savage Love. It has been a hit for 25 years. He's also got his super popular podcast, Savage Lovecast, and he started the It Gets Better project, which has already gotten its moment here, which is a fabulous thing. He also makes you blush. Sometimes he might. I don't know if he will today.
Do my best.
He'll do his best. Esther Perel, at the end, is a psychotherapist in New York and a writer. She's the author of Mating in Captivity, a New York Times bestseller, an upcoming book on infidelity and the modern marriage. She's featured in an extraordinarily popular TED Talk. She's not featured, she gave the talk. 13 million views to date all over the world. She has been called the nation's sexual healer by the New York Times. She's consultant on the show The Affair, which is a fabulous show, and a columnist at Cosmo. So welcome to all of the panelists. Okay, Dan, it's your turn to pep us up now. So you have been listening to people's questions about sex for so many years. So my question is, has the sense of kind of secrecy and shame diminished over the years? Like, have you noticed people just being more comfortable in their skin when they ask you about things?
Yes. And it's self-serving, I think, to some degree, and I want to credit largely the queer rights movement and also, perversely, the AIDS epidemic.
What do you mean?
Well, gay people coming out in the face of judgment and shame about their sexual expression and sexual identities really inspired a lot of straight people to embrace their sexual identities, which went beyond just, I want to meet somebody, get married, and have some babies. Gay people were the original recreational sexers, and really kind of called the question on what sex is for and what sex does in a relationship or in a life, irrespective of the relationship models that you embrace. And I think that inspired a lot of straight people. There's a lot of, if you look at the way straight people live now and the way gay people live now, there's
It's
a lot
reversed.
Overlap.
a lot of overlap. A lot of the ways in which straight people live now are exactly how gay people lived then, and we were told it was a hedonistic lifestyle for which we were condemned. Straight people just changed the names of everything. We had fuck buddies, you have friends with benefits.
Right.
We tricked, you hook up. Like you
Yeah,
just
we got married and now you get married, so.
Right, exactly. So
Yeah.
you see straight people living the way gay people lived until their early 30s, living like straight people, and you see gay people living the way gay people did until their early 30s, and then getting married like straight people. And in a way, I think the AIDS epidemic forced us to have conversations about not the sex we all agreed everybody ought to be having, but the sex that people were actually having. Because
Right, I
there
see.
was a life and death issue or question at the heart of that. And it really, the AIDS epidemic reversed a lot of the judgment, because things that were normal were suddenly less safe than things that were perverse. Because if you were having penetrative sex, that was riskier, just vaginal intercourse or anal intercourse, even with a condom, riskier than getting fist fucked, if I may be frank, and other sorts of sex acts that were always held up as evidence of moral depravity and unsafe sexual expression were suddenly safer
Right.
than the good normal stuff.
I see. At least it forced things into different categories than they had previously been.
We had to judge them on their merits and the ways in which they were done, rather than coming to them with like having prejudged them and
Right.
pre-condemned them. And I really think that changed the way people talk about sex and feel about sex, and the way they feel entitled to sex and desire. And a lot of closets were opened after gay people came out of there.
Interesting. So that's positive. You feeling better?
The best thing by far is that Dan Savage just said fist fucked at the Aspen Institute.
And the second best thing is that you just repeated it, so thank you.
Now it's your turn.
No.
Let's all say it.
No, I hold the dignity. I'm the moderator.
Hashtag joke, people. I want to see some serious Twitter action on that.
Making
Really, I can't
Aspen hot. That's what we
The
do
thing is that
here.
I specifically remember being with all of you last night, sitting on the couch, and Hannah saying, Dan, please just keep it tame tomorrow.
Yes.
Just keep it tame.
That is tame. He was practically lecturing there. That is tame. Okay, Eric, your turn. So Dan is talking about an evolution. Can you talk to us about what demographics have led us there? Like, why is it that we have this space to experiment? What's changed such that we are in this place where sex is not just the sex that you have in marriage?
I mean, there are many things here. Let's take to begin the fact that we now have this stage of life that we just didn't have before, where people are staying single as adults, actually becoming adults, through their 20s, up into their 30s, and sometimes beyond. It used to be 60 years ago that people were getting married in their early 20s, and they're often marrying people who are from their neighborhoods. People their families had close contacts with, people they went to church with, people they went to schools with. And they never had a moment of personal liberation that was free of parental control. And so as the age of first marriage has gone up, and in some cases as people have exited the marriage option altogether, we've created this stage of life. Sociologists call it emerging adulthood. Aziz, with whom I collaborated on Modern Romance, calls it the stage of life when people are just dicking around having brunch. So
I'm counting the words. We're on 3 now. Our limit is 5, and we still have a long way to go. So go. Yes.
Did you hear Loretta Lynch earlier today?
Yeah. Okay.
So there's this period of experimentation where people are able to make all kinds of choices for themselves without worrying about the surveillance of people in their communities, especially their families. That's an enormous change. So we see it reflected in the range of people's sexual experiences. We also see it in the kinds of relationships that emerge. So, for instance, the real spike in interethnic and interracial, even in interreligious marriage happens during this period, post-1960s, when we give people more years to experience the world as singles. Mm-hmm. And I think that has really given people a chance to discover who they are, what they want, personally and sexually as well. That's been one of many drivers. I think the other, and I think Eric hit this very well, is the rising status of women in the world. Which is not just about women entering into the paid labor market. It's also about women having control of their own bodies, of their own lives, having access to legitimate sexual desire and being able to express their interests and needs. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole new vocabulary, a whole new kind of conversation, a new kind of intimacy that I think we're still struggling to work out. Mm-hmm. But that's clearly changed what it means to be sexual today.
Esther, can you deepen this for us? When he says we're struggling to work it all out, what has this era of kind of infinite possibility, infinite choice, infinite striving for personal satisfaction, when people come into your office, say, and are struggling with this, what new set of challenges has that led in people's relationships? This idea that they have this period where they can have sex and be liberated and have lots of choices about what they do. Then they come to you, and what are the issues that arise from that new kind of I want to be satisfied and happy feeling that we all have?
Well, one of the opening lines could be, we love each other very much, we have no sex. I know my partner loves me dearly. It's been years since I felt wanted. And they know the difference. And they long for that experience of being desired.
Which they had in this period, or?
Sometimes they had it, but sometimes they still wish they could experience it. This is the first time that we are trying to be sexual with one partner, many of us, for the long haul, and the long haul is twice as long. You know, not because we want 8 children, for which we're going to need to have 10, because 2 won't make it, and not because it's, as Eric said, a woman's marital duty, but because we want it, because it is rooted in desire, which is to own the wanting as an expression of freedom and sovereignty, and for pleasure and for connection. And this is a grand experiment. This is not something that we've ever done before. Here is this generation, post-68, that has, for the first time in the West, let's be very clear, premarital sex as a norm, pretty much.
For years.
For years, yes.
Right.
I would say since the late 60s. The permission to do what they want, often cohabitation before marriage. Marriage used to be the time when you had sex for the first time. Now marriage is when you stop having sex with others. You know? And you want, and you don't understand why you don't want. So the crisis of desire accompanies us wherever romanticism has entered. Romanticism, which basically would say, you have found the one, and now that you have found the one after the 15 years of nomadism that Eric is talking about, you wouldn't want to look at anybody else anymore, because that one is going to give you everything you've been looking for. You know, one person that's going to give you what once an entire village used to provide. And this is kind of the model. So the crisis of desire is actually very strong, in the sense that if you look at it just as having sex, no, it's not about the having sex, because sex isn't just something you do. What we're talking about is the experience of sexuality, the feeling of aliveness, renewal, playfulness, the erotic component. People want the poetics of sex. They don't just want the act sex. Women have done the act sex forever and felt nothing. That is not the point. And he doesn't want her to do the service anymore either. He also wants her to want it. Everybody is in a crisis of wanting. You know, wanting to want, make me want, I don't want anymore, or I want what I can't have, or what I want is everything but you know. Like Time magazine did this article about sexless couples, and it was about, you know, if you have sex less than 11 times a year, then you are a sexless couple, and if it's more than 11 times a year, consider yourselves blessed. And, you know, and
Wait, the standard was 11 times a year?
Cover of
That's
Time magazine.
blessed?
Yes.
Whoa.
And I thought to myself, with each other. Just add with each other,
Right.
you know, because sex seems to have, after everything we're going to hear here, it's going on in lots of places, but not necessarily in the place where people want to have a meaningful, intimate, erotic, exciting, somewhat passionate connection for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Now, Emily, we've been talking about all of this opening in terms of feminist progress, and yet one feels that the feminists are increasingly ambivalent, and that the sense of sex is dangerous is actually with us again among feminists, or at least that there's a robust debate among feminists about whether this moment is good or scary. So can you talk about that and how that came back?
Yes, I think you're right about both of those things. You know, when we talk about feminism, we're not talking about one set of beliefs. It's hard to define. Probably, I hope everyone on the stage would define themselves as a feminist, but in these internal struggles and discussions, people can line up quite differently. So there's a big discussion happening right now in feminism about rape and sexual assault, and whether all of the freedom and exploration, which Dan was talking about, which has given people much more ability to be sexual in different ways, also makes women more vulnerable to abuse, to coercion. One of the big points within feminism about this is, how do you define consent? And is there anything to be done about the fact that rape historically and currently is defined in part in terms of the male point of view? If you think of men as the perpetrators in rape cases, which they almost always are, the answer from the point of view of criminal law is that we need to know something about the point of view of the accused perpetrator, because what else separates a sexual act from rape? So much of this is contextual. Instead of like taking someone's wallet in a mugging, where you can see from the act itself that this is a crime, that we don't necessarily have that with rape. But there are some, what I would call radical feminists, who are very concerned about the idea that we're paying any attention at all to what men's perceptions of this experience is. So that's one set of tensions. And the other one I'll bring up is a deep, deep division over sex work, and this question of whether feminists and human rights advocates should be pushing to decriminalize sex work, which is what a lot of sex worker activist organizing groups very much want, especially abroad in developing countries.
And can you just briefly say, why would you decriminalize sex work? And any of you jump in, by the way. You don't have to wait for me if you have things to say about sex work, but go ahead.
So the reason that these groups are asking to decriminalize is that abroad in particular, where often people engage in sex work for a spectrum of reasons, not necessarily forced into it so much as pushed by economic necessity, there is really good evidence that if sex workers are able to organize, they can protect their health and their rights better. Rates of AIDS go down dramatically, abuse from the police, from clients. There are all these ways in which they're better able to protect themselves if they organize, and of course, if what you're doing is criminal, it's very hard to organize. But then there is a radical feminist response to this, which is that sex work is inevitably a source of great sexual inequality, and that what human rights advocates should be doing is fighting to prevent sex work, to give women other options, rather than trying to protect the people who are doing it. So to some degree, I think of this as a split between a kind of ideological stance about sex work, that it is inevitably one thing inequality versus a more pragmatic look at it, which takes into account a spectrum of experiences. And if you talk to people who do sex work, which I did a lot of for my story, you hear a real range of experiences about what people are bringing to this, what it's like for them, why they're doing it, how they feel about it, a big range. And that, for me, was really important and surprising and broke down my own assumptions and made me feel like it's really important to make room for a lot of different experiences. So I think that is a kind of struggle for feminists who are more ideological about this than I am, and that maybe some of you are.
A big cultural divide.
Yeah, I mean, when I read your story, I thought, could really America, it would mean sex, the resistance to sex work decriminalization, it just encapsulates so much about the American, lack of flexibility around sex.
Same-sex marriage was impossible, and legal marijuana was impossible, and here we are in Colorado.
Right.
Right. It's true that these legal norms seem incredibly entrenched, and then all of a sudden, poof, they're not. But I share your feeling. In some ways, you can think of this as a last bastion of our very American impulse to regulate morality and sexual morality as opposed to trying to prevent harm.
Esther, can you talk about that because you are sort of a citizen of the world, you travel a lot of places, talk about infidelity and sex and marriage. Do you see America as especially Puritan, especially resistant to kind of, the give and take of the range of sexuality that exists?
That's such a dangerous question.
No, I mean, we have some things on our side, like gay marriage. I mean, there's been a lot of, progress.
I'm from Belgium, and we had gay marriage long before.
But you didn't gay adoption.
No, we don't have gay adoption, correct. No, I think that when you say a cross-cultural point of view, you can place yourself in many different parts of the world. So I'm going to just take a kind of a European point of view. I was at a panel earlier on adolescence and sexuality. America is the only Western industrialized country that does not have a public health policy on adolescent sexuality. It has onset of sexual activity 2 years before the liberal Dutch. It has more STD.
What do you mean? What is the public? You mean like in schools?
Like in America, sex is the risk factor. In Europe, sex is a normal part of your development. Being irresponsible is the risk factor. So we have sex education from age 4 in our public schools. And it's not sex education, it's sexual health and reproductive health. It's a much more all-encompassing. We teach you how to eat, and we teach you how to have hygiene, and we teach you about your sexual health. It's an integrated part of who you are. It's not sex.
Right.
This thing, it's dirty, but save it for the one you love. Kind of very American way of thinking. So that's one. Then you have,
Wait, can you say, there's one thing additionally on this. Last night you were telling me about the children's books you found in Europe to read to your kids who you raised in the United States that introduced them to sex and sexuality starting at age 4, you said?
Yes.
And you...
There's a reason why it's 4. It's 4 in the educational system in Belgium and in Holland. I'm from the Flemish part of Belgium, so we copy a rather close to the Dutch model. But basically, at age 4, children are theologians. For the first time, they ask you, where do I come from and where do we go? And from that place, it becomes the kind of natural age, the developmental age, by which to start to speak about sexuality. But they're not talking. So this little book, this is Larousse. It's the most, you find it in the supermarket. It's nothing special. And it tells the story of the kitten that is having babies. And then the child says, the kitten is having babies and how it's about us. And then the father takes the notepad and he starts to draw. And then he compares it to other animals and the chickens and the elephants and the gestation period. It's totally heteronormative, I have to say.
Fine with me.
And, and then it explains how the man and the woman come together, and when they love each other, they kiss each other, and it makes them feel really good. And from that place, it's a story. There's not a word called private parts in there.
The private parts.
That's the American book. It's private parts. It's about you're going to defend yourself, you know.
Why are you cringing, Emily? Because it's so familiar. It's so hopeless.
Defend America.
No.
It's true. We talk about it like a car, like a mechanic.
You know why we're in this fix? It's because Canada got the French, Australia got the convicts, and we got the Puritans who were dumped on us by the Dutch.
So, there's a wonderful book actually that just came out. I hope it will be translated, and it's called Sex in America, The Other History of America, and it's actually written by a French political scientist. And the whole premise of the book is this. It's like, what happened to this country when the Puritans won? It's not just that the Puritans came, other people came too, but the Puritans won, and it's not its attitude only to sexuality. It's in general an attitude to pleasure, an attitude to excess, an intense focus on control, on self-control, and on the self controlling itself. That's kind of things that are going in there. And so, as I said in the panel yesterday, Americans don't cheat any less than the French. They just feel more guilty about it. It doesn't change the behavior.
And that hatred of pleasure is why when you look at someone who's against gay marriage, you know they're also against easy access to contraception. They're also against abortion rights. They're usually against women's rights. They're against any sort of sex for pleasure. And gay marriage and gay people being open about who we are, that's the only kind of sex we have, is sex for pleasure. And they want to see women and men who have sex for pleasure, not intending to procreate, punished. Hence, their opposition to the HPV vaccine from the religious right was a piece of this Puritan hatred of pleasure and desire to see people punished, and particularly people who don't want to punish themselves. Like, if you feel bad about it, okay, good enough, but if you don't feel bad about it, we're going to work to make you feel bad.
Yeah, I think this is also part of the deep story about why so much.
Sorry.
I
I just became an American, I have to say.
I think.
Right, you will never have sex with pleasure again. Welcome to our country.
Have the sex feel bad, eat the cheesecake feel bad.
But so isn't this also one of the reasons why so much sex on college campus and so much of the problematic sex on college campus comes only after outrageous amounts of drinking?
Yes.
Right? That to get yourself in a zone where you feel like you can do the things that you know are sanctioned, that are dirty and wrong,
Right.
you obliterate
something to
yourself.
blame.
You obliterate yourself. You dull your senses. You take yourself out of the zone of ordinary ethical conduct.
It's actually an ultimate expression of anxiety, because if you like it, you would want to remember it. You know? The notion that you actually want to inebriate yourself to the point of obliteration speaks just to the anxiety that people bring to it, rather than the comfort, the ease, and that is not about the act sex. The problem also here is that when people talk about sex, they talk often about the doing sex. America is a doing culture. It thinks in action terms, so it's doing.
All verbs.
You know, it's a very, and the field of sex therapy is about function, dysfunction. You know, Viagra is about doing. And the flibanserin is about doing. It's getting people to do it. Is the focus of the.
Is that not true in other countries? The phrase "to do it." I mean, that literally means to have sex. So does it?
Sex. On fait l'amour. We make love.
Yeah, in America, that's a little cheesy, right? Yeah, we don't
that's
really use
cheesy
that
for
so
sure.
much.
You
Yeah.
know? The doing actually comes. There's lots of slang words for fucking, you know, but that's number 4. Sorry.
Or
They sell Nikes over there.
so, Emily, I feel the need to stick up for America by denigrating the other countries. So we're always idealizing the kind of, the Dutch, the Swedish, the Scandinavian. Can you give us something that they did bad in the sex work models?
Well, so back to my questions about decriminalizing sex work, the Swedes in 1999 came up with the idea of criminalizing the purchase of sex.
That's right.
So they entered into a legal landscape in which it was legal both to buy and sell sex, and they criminalized the purchasing of it. This was a change led by radical feminists, and the idea was that very deliberately the culture was going to stigmatize sex work, but instead of punishing women for doing it, the traditional American and really international response, the Swedes were going to put the onus on men in their efforts to prevent this. So this law, this approach, which is known as the Swedish model or the Nordic model, has gotten a lot of attention. Most of the groups that are trying to abolish sex work, in the radical feminist and other camps, are pushing this model because right now in the US and in the West, it's really not acceptable to talk about arresting women for prostitution. Much safer to go after the men. Everyone assumes that they're deviants, that this is the bad part. The problem with the Swedish model as it's played out in Sweden and Norway is that in fact, when you look at the impact it has on the ground, it's actually still punitive towards women. How does that happen? Well, if you're criminalizing someone's line of work or what someone's doing to make money, then you make it impossible for them to go to the police, right? Because they're really going to be at risk too, or they may very well feel that the police aren't going to be on their side. And so sex workers in Sweden and Norway talk a lot about how they don't feel like they can turn to the cops for help, and that their clients have become more demanding of secretive, furtive activity because they know that they can be targeted, and so they want to go to remote places in which there's less protection.
And also, as you unpacked in your piece, and it's true that they arrest the client, they arrest the job, but then they deport the woman. They didn't send her to prison for being a prostitute, but they deported her, or they took her children away from her, or she lost her other job.
Yes.
So there's still repercussions and punitive ones for the women selling. They're just not punishing specifically for the selling.
Yeah,
Right.
that's not like Sweden bad. That's just like
I don't know.
Sweden good intention. I mean, we do all that and more, so we still come out worse.
That's true, but I do think this notion that everything is better in Scandinavia is called into question by the
There's
effects
one
that
thing
we're
you
talking
really
about.
definitely do more better. I mean, from the Belgian and French legal system, we copied an enormous amount on sexual harassment in the workplace.
That's a really good
That
point.
is a place where you have led and protected women unequivocally.
Yes, that's a good point.
So I want to, by the way, audience, I'm going to let you ask questions after this panel before we move to our next panel. So you can have a voice, not yet, but just get them going in
Can
your
I add
head.
something to
Yeah.
what Emily said about sex work and the ideological thing, that it's about inequality. The paradox of that is that prohibition makes the harms of sex work that people point to when they argue ideologically about inequality incalculably worse. So in service to the ideology of inequality, these sex workers that we're told we can't decriminalize sex work because they are the victims and they must be protected are actually punished and are actually harmed. And so in service of this ideology, these people who claim to care so much about the sex workers who have been coerced, sex workers who have been economically coerced or coerced by other forces, the least effective way to help them is to maintain prohibition, is to oppose decriminalization.
And sex worker activists, as you well know, have gotten very good at saying all of this for themselves. They don't really need me as their mouthpiece. If you can go online and read lots about them making all these points with a lot of great rhetorical elegance. And in this country, it's really hard for them to become a political force, but that is happening in certain other countries. And some surprising places, India, Thailand, places we might not expect to look to, but which may in some ways be providing models.
Also, at some point in the sex work conversation, we always have to mention there are male sex workers
Yes.
that service male
And
clients.
lots of trans people who do
And
sex
lots of trans people, and they're often the most victimized by violence, and particularly violence from the authorities, from the cops. But we never talk about male sex workers when we talk about sex work, as if they didn't exist.
Or sexual abuse, or there's a lot of times where we take the position of the woman and the girl.
The
child.
statistics on male rape are actually shocking. Men who are raped, the increased incidence, either because more men are reporting it, but the good, thorough studies about male rape show it to be unbelievably
But also, 1 in 6 boys are abused in their own, educational systems or family systems. So I think it's a very important point to not have a bias that is so completely forgetting.
that we don't see the whole picture.
Yeah.
I want to talk for our last few minutes before questions about technology. So technology is the thing, when I think about what gives us the sense that sex is everywhere and we're totally cool with it, like it really is our phones and our screens, like where we have the sense it's just ubiquitous and everywhere and America's fine with it now. And yet that's not exactly the conclusion we should draw. So Eric, can you talk about technology and dating and the kind of funny things you turned up about technology injecting itself into the dating process and what happens?
Sure. Right. So the kind of first point to make here is that we in the United States are overwhelmingly turning to the internet to find romantic partners. The search for love is really different than it was. The modern romance book begins with this quick story about marriage in Philadelphia and in most American cities in the 1930s, where people would meet, fall in love with, and marry people who lived in their building, people who lived on their block. It was a very local phenomenon, and today the most common place to meet your spouse in the United States is the internet.
The most common?
The most likely place where an American is likely will meet a spouse is the internet. And what's amazing about that is all of that comes before the era of Tinder. Another thing the straight people stole from gay men.
Called it Grindr.
Add to your list. Exactly. Add to your list. One of the things that Tinder is doing, so Tinder's a swipe app. It's it's on your phone.
Is it on your phone? Because you're married. You were about to take out your phone and show us your Tinder app?
Can I? First of all, let me tell you, as you well know, my mother is in the audience tonight.
Oh, okay. Hi, Mom. But you reached for the phone so reflexively. I felt,
I think you need to drop this line of questioning. Please go on.
Yeah, go ahead. As you were saying, you know
that Woody Allen short in New York Stories where the guy's mother disappears and he shows
up in his
So like when you're a Jewish guy and you have the experience of your mother coming to your sex panel at the Aspen you've hit like a whole new threshold. So I am going to bring out my prop because whether or not I have Tinder on my phone, only some of you will know. Whether or not I do, what's happened is that for people in their 20s, having this is like carrying a singles bar in your pocket everywhere you go. So it is no longer the case that if you are looking for love or sex, you need to go to particular places where you're most likely to find it. You are just carrying it with you. You can turn it on at your will. And Tinder, which is just kind of the app of the moment, there'll be another one in a year or two, is bringing all kinds of very young people. I've heard of high school students who have Tinder into the world of online dating. So even a few years ago, there was a bit of a stigma about online dating, like college people didn't want to do it. It was something when you in your mid to late 20s acknowledge that, okay, I haven't found the person I want, or I can't just find people at parties, I need to go and do this artificial thing. Now it's part of the culture. So in a very short period of time, overwhelmingly we will connect with our romantic partners here. By the way, that's not just true for very young people. The fastest growing group that's getting online are older adults.
So, Mom, are you on Tinder? That might be awkward.
We're going to bring her up, ladies and gentlemen, right?
Can I jump in here for a second? Because usually when this here comes technology and everyone's on Tinder, it's bad, it's ominous, and there are upsides to this.
For sure.
We have said culturally that it is not okay to hit on people at work. It is not okay to hit on people on the bus or in classes. We need spaces that when we enter them, we're saying, now you may approach me. Here I am in this space at this time. It is an appropriate time for you to hit on me, as opposed to at work, on the street, on the bus. Not that people still don't hit on people in those places. They do, but they're self-selected, boundaryless assholes.
It's actually a form of consent.
Moreover, one of the reasons that these swipe apps are becoming popular is that they often give women the capacity to enter into the conversation, right? So on Tinder, both parties need to swipe right on each other before a conversation starts. There's another app where the woman has to initiate, right? So there are these other issues about sexual inequality that show up, not just in sex work.
They're corrected for, in a way, that make the world a safer place, not a more depressing, technologically terrorized place.
Exactly. So by no means do I mean to say, Tinder's coming to a phone near you, duck. That's not the point.
I don't think you need to say that. I think that's where people instinctively go.
Yeah, that's right.
When we talk about technology and sexuality, it's a problem.
Yeah.
We hear scare stories, and they come to stand for the whole experience in a way that's actually not.
But I'll tell you the thing that's so interesting about this, and that is that we have built up over generations or even longer a kind of code of conduct, a certain set of cultural norms about how we will approach one another. And obviously, like some of the times that's after like 12 beer bongs or something like that on a college campus, and that works out really, really badly. but there's a whole way that people approach each other and show interest and express their love and interest. I want to ask you out on a date. There's something called a date. You both know you're going on a date, and that means something that's different than hanging out. And now the conundrum that so many people face is we've moved the medium of how we interact from face to face to face to screen, machine to machine, and people are really having a hard time figuring out what to say to one another. Right? What should you?
Without all the visual cues, you mean?
Well, so you meet someone you're attracted to, and you want to ask them out. So would you actually ask that person out in person?
I'm
Would
way
you
too old
would
to
you
know
call them? Yeah.
Just try it. Let's role play.
Would you? I was like, I'm going to embarrass this guy no matter what I do today. So what's so interesting here is when Aziz and I did all of these interviews and focus groups with people, we actually had people hand us their phones. You could see people not knowing, should I call? Someone would say, oh, I'm dying. If someone would call me, that would be the greatest thing in the world. Should I text? Other people say, if someone called me, that would be so weird. Don't call me unless you're on fire. Basically, I don't want to.
Well, my absolute favorite part of that book is like Aziz on both of your analyses of the bozo texts that men send, and then like the instructions for young men on how to not send bozo texts to women.
So people are sweating out. Like if you have a 20-something-year-old person in your life, or 20, like please be kind to this person. They are sweating out like the most difficult things, like how many exclamation points to put after in their text. Or someone texts you, you have to figure out, when do you text back? Do you text back right away? Does that show desperation?
And what does an eggplant mean?
What is an eggplant?
Which dick pic should you enclose?
5.
What is that hand coming out of the?
That's number 5. Yeah.
So it turns out like the bar for what counts as a good text, the bar is so incredibly low.
English, for example.
Literally, like if you can spell and use decent grammar, you're 90% ahead of everybody else in the field. And
right, that's what game is now. Game is like being able to spell.
So we would do these focus groups with women on one side of the room and men on the other side of the room. And women, like we would read a text, like a text message from a guy that would have 3 things, like "Hi Stacy," so he knows it's your name, right? It's not "Hey," right?
Salutation.
Sup. "Hi Stacy, it's Eric from the bar the other night." Then some kind of if you could say that, you want to go out sometime next week. Like women stood up and applauded. It was the most amazing thing they had ever seen. Like the guy could have married all of them. The bar is so incredibly low. It's
all right, Esther, jump in here because I'm going to open up for a few minutes of questions before we move on.
What you're highlighting is that there's a difference between connectivity and relatedness. Is that you have a lot of people who know how to connect online, but that doesn't mean they know how to relate.
Of course.
And then what you're saying also is that part of what we have on social media is actually in both directions. It's not only how you start, but it's also how you end. And a major feature of this choice, this massive market that we all can go in, is that we relish this enormous set of possibilities, but we also have to then deal with the uncertainty and the self-doubt about knowing if you chose the right person. So now we created a thing that I call a situation of stable ambiguity. And stable ambiguity in technology parlance goes from simmering to icing to ghosting. So you simmer, which means you kind of just do this, "Hi, what's up?" but then you do it again a few days later just to see if the other person is still there without really getting engaged, so that you create a kind of a holding pattern where you get the comfort of consistency, but you can still maintain the freedom of the blurred lines, And then the ghosting, so icing, simmering, icing is the longer version of this, and then the ghosting is really this way that you can just cut somebody off. There's not many more words for saying, "Hi, I like you, I'm interested in you," as there is for actually saying, "I'm done with you, and I have deleted you on the spot." And people have been rejected forever, but the speed with which they can do it. And I think the last one that to me is really important on the digital is that it's never been easier to cheat, and it's ever been more difficult to keep a secret. All affairs, 90% of them probably, I found out, affairs, transgressions, cheating, sex that wasn't supposed to happen of any sort, is found in the phone. That same phone that you're talking about. But you no longer just find a receipt or a little bit of lipstick on a color. You get the digital archive, and that's a death by 1,000 cuts. You get detail by detail, text by text, picture by picture of the last 3 years.
So I think that's right, and that's a danger. There's another thing about the digital also, though, because as Dan said, we quickly go to how it's tearing us apart and what it can do. But we also have, if you're in a romantic relationship, you likely have a digital archive of all the connections that you made with the person you fell in love with. You have the messages you sent to each other, you have the photographs and the places you went. In Korea, there's an app called Between that allows couples to create a world for themselves where they can deepen their intimacy. There are all kinds of ways in which we can use technology to deepen our ties and our kind of romantic relationships. And not just romantic relationships, but our intimate relationships more generally.
And what
I think all of this
became
is
of your ex? What became of your ex? We've never been able to go back in time and pick up a story that ended 20 years ago.
Unfortunately, that turns out to be back where the adultery comes in, but
They're specialty.
One of the
No,
positives.
Yeah.
no,
right? There can also be something quite lovely about that.
it can be for sure, and there are lots of relationships that get sustained. I mean, a really interesting problem that a lot of people came to us with is that they were in relationships that had a life on social media, and then the relationship ended, and they had this archive of photographs on Facebook. Basically, everyone under 40 is nodding at me right now. So there's a whole problem where you've got this history. So it was very difficult to know what to do because even if you unfriend them, like they're still there in the photos. So this one woman had this great idea, which is that she basically went back after she broke up with her boyfriend and she photoshopped Beyonce over her boyfriend's face. They've been together, so it's like she had a long history with Beyonce. I think that really, the last point I'll make on this is I think we're just at the very beginning of learning how to deal with these technologies, and we're developing a new set of norms. And several years from now, we'll look back on this moment and think how kind of naive and unfortunate we were to have blundered our way through this. But it's inevitable, and it's fascinating for sociologists to watch us develop a new set of norms and expectations so that we don't do all the boneheaded things that people are doing now.
Okay, guys, we have time for like 2 quick questions before we move on to our next. Are we doing the microphone? So here, orange shirt.
Hi, on the subject of all these online dating services, do you think that just this ease of swiping right, swiping left, and there being a sense of a never-ending supply, and I'm thinking mostly of my college-age kids, that they will sort of dilute the preciousness of the search and the cultivation of ultimately a nice relationship because there just seems to be this unending supply?
I don't know if it will kill the preciousness of the search. The search is going to be different, but I think the challenge that people face when they're dating online, and the companies recognize this and are trying to deal with it, is the overwhelming number of choices that people are presented with. They're actually not choices. They're not really a choice or an option until they express interest in you and want to go out with you. But people make the mistake all the time of looking at the profiles of all these beautiful people online and thinking they have options. It's a really serious thing. But it turns out that just like all the classical kind of the studies on the paradox of choice that Barry Schwartz and Sheena Iyengar have done, when people have an abundance of options, they have first a really difficult time making a decision. It's paralyzing to why choose this and not something else. But then more importantly, once you do make a decision, I'm going to go out with her. As soon as you start, you wonder why you didn't go out with all the other ones who are there, and you start to question yourself.
But you should take some comfort in the fact that you want to have someone. That you could have anyone isn't going to make you feel better about having no one. So people will eventually pick.
I think that's right, and the big thing is for people to learn that what's really interesting and distinctive and special about another person generally doesn't come out the first time you meet them. It takes some sustained interactions. So I think people are too quick to give up on someone when what we really need to do is give relationships a chance to work. The other thing is people spend way too much time in online dating doing the online part and not enough time doing the dating part. They need to use online dating sites as kind of introduction services and to get to the face-to-face interaction, which is where something happens.
All right, you had your hand up.
Grace.
Hi there. Could you comment a little bit on the whole concept that I've been reading about of sexual fluidity, and you hear about it in Hollywood, stars that test homosexual relations, go to heterosexual relationships, they consider themselves bisexual. Can you comment on the state of that?
I think it's not just stars.
No.
Well, there are people who are bisexual. There are some people who would describe themselves as sexually fluid and gender fluid. It's interesting. I don't think it's necessarily contagious. I think a lot of us
Is there more space for it, though?
No, there is more space for it. It's less stigmatized, so there's more of it. More people who always are and always were sexually fluid or gender fluid can now be out about it. But I think most of us are sexual and gender solids.
Is that true? Do you think the norming changes an internal reality, or do you think it's just that is it just a history of repression? In other words, it's just that people were ashamed to express themselves, or that...
A little bit of both.
Yeah, but I'm always really curious about that.
People who are socially liberal, progressive, they have a lot of queer friends, they have a lot of trans friends and gender nonconforming friends who are themselves pretty
solid,
like gender conforming girly girls and guys. And it's not an act.
Right.
They're not just like repressed into that. That's actually who they are. You as a gender fluid person, that can be who you are. We have to acknowledge that somebody who's the opposite of that can also be who they are. And they're not just suffering under some sort of false consciousness or acting out of some oppression that's boxed them into this.
Well, maybe when you said celebrities, what she was getting at is a sense like, is there a way in which it just becomes trendy as opposed to an expression of a genuine internal reality? Maybe.
But I think that the trend, if it's not a trend, I think that part of what is central to our culture today is personal expression and a quest to a certain kind of authenticity. And with that, a sense of self-actualization and all of that. And sexuality has become a space for that kind of self-expression. It used to be a condition, part of our biology. Thanks to contraception, science, women's movement, gay movement, it has become a part of our identity. And so to have fluidity of explorations that are part of our exploration of our overall identity becomes an integrated part. In the same way that we are doing more than one profession today. Forever, people did one thing, and it usually was what their father had done. Today, you do something for 20 years, you change, you should do something else. Well, you have women, they're married to a man for 20 years, then they go live with a woman for 10 years, then they come back. I mean, as a whole, we are creating fluidity in many areas of our lives where before we were much more singular.
Eric, Emily, Dan, Esther, thank you so much. Let's all thank them for being so fabulous. Yeah. We're going to give you guys a few seconds break while we invite our next two panelists, and Emily's going to stay with us. You will notice we've made a generational shift on stage.
The youth are here to set us straight.
To set us straight, tell us what's going on, teach us about technology. No, that's not what they're going to do. I had a panel last night about podcasts, and I would say half the panel was spent literally taking out people's phones and showing them how to download podcast apps. But that's not what we're going to do
More
today.
More podcast listeners for the world.
Exactly.
Spreading the gospel.
So Emily's going to stay with us for this part of the conversation, and we're going to introduce two new people. At the edge of the stage is Leah Fessler. She's a 2015 graduate of Middlebury, a published writer. She wrote a very personal account of her discomfort with the hookup culture at college, and her thesis on the hookup culture can be downloaded online. The thing that I personally love about her writing and the thing that she wrote, and which we're going to talk about a lot today, is you often hear, as Emily says a lot, the disaster cases. Those are the ones that rise to the surface, things that have gone horribly wrong, rape cases, sexual assault. But the thing that was so instructive about what Leah wrote is that she wrote about the norm. She wrote about the experience of just a person going through the hookup culture in college and what that was like and what that did for her. So that's why we have her here today. And then we have Stephanie Addenbrooke. She's the editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News, and she has overseen coverage of sexual assault on campus, and she previously reported on crime and student affairs. So these guys are emissaries from young college life. Leah, so Leah's article, we'll start with that, was called "Most Women Don't Enjoy Hookup Culture, so Why Do We Participate in It?" It included a lot of statistics that she found when she did vast surveys for her own thesis. The overwhelming sense I got from you about college life, and you guys can reflect it back to me, is that although sex is everywhere in college, no one actually talks about it. No one actually talks about it, what it is, or actually knows anything about it.
Or how to make it good.
Or how to make it good for one thing, but even like it's just this thing that's everywhere, but has remained kind of mysterious and dangerous.
Yeah. Okay, this is on.
Yeah.
So I think the interesting thing about what you just said is, and Emily and I were discussing this a little bit beforehand, actually my personal experience and through interviews is that we talk a lot about sex to our mutual gender groups. What we don't talk a lot about sex is to the people we're having sex with. And so that's, I find, where like the most miscommunication occurs. And so when it comes to the actual like mechanics of if we know what we're doing when we're having sex, I think that's a huge issue. You know, I think that we're assumed, as we've been socialized, you know, sexual liberation is all the norm for women. We are no longer living in any sort of the puritanical era that was discussed before.
Well, you're saying that's true, or that's the feminist?
The assumption.
That's the assumption.
So when we go into college, you know, like we think that we're having good sex, and we think that it's enjoyable, but so often what I found, both personally and through interviews, is that we're feeling basically nothing at all, and we're not receiving, you know, adequate education on, you know, like how we ought to be experiencing pleasure. And I think the biggest disconnect is that that conversation so infrequently happens between sexual partners in the casual romantic realm. I think it's probably better when people are in relationships, but the real tragedy to me is that so many people go through 4 years without ever discussing their sexual preferences with the people they're consistently having sex with.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think something that is really striking, which you probably found too, is when you go to a school which has people from all different backgrounds. You know, some people had no sexual education through high school. Some people had a lot of sexual education through high school. And not just formal education, but like a social education too. Some people grew up in towns where, you know, it was maybe very conservative attitudes on sex. Others were feeling very liberated at the age of 14. And so you have all of these people come together, and there's not a great way to talk about, like, maybe where are we? Like, what's happening? You seem to have a very different experience to me, and I don't know how to communicate kind of with you what my experience has been, what I'm seeing. And I think for some people that can actually be very disconcerting, and it means the hookup culture, kind of, as Leah's article kind of indicated, is like, maybe that's just what I have to do because it seems like everybody's doing it, and my social education, my high school education didn't teach me anything about sex, so that's kind of what I'm going to go with. And I think that can be disconcerting, but also like,
I want to even break it down and talk about terms. Like, I think when we all say the word relationships, it means a completely different thing to everybody in this room. So you use the word in your story, pseudo-relationships. What is a pseudo-relationship? What does that mean?
So frequently, the trouble that I took when I was beginning to research this and when I was in school myself looking for writing and resources on, you know, what I was feeling is that so often when we talk about hookup culture in college, we're referring to one-night stands, you know, like technically emotionless, commitmentless, sexual encounters that are brief. I did not find that happened at Middlebury, but what was much more common and troubling is what you brought up, the pseudo-relationship. That's kind of like people have all different types of terms for it. We're together, we're seeing each other. It basically just means that two individuals have been sexually engaging with one another for a series of weeks or even months or sometimes even over a year without officially defining the terms, without even officially clarifying that they're exclusive. And so the question's always like, oh, you guys are together, but are you exclusive? And this is just like completely ridiculous and often hypocritical because Yale's probably the same at Middlebury. We have so much work and so much homework. Like, to think that the guy that you're sleeping with every weekend night and once or twice during the week is also doing this with a couple other girls, which not to say it doesn't happen, it certainly did. is insane. I mean, like, who has time for that? Yet the complete hypocrisy
One
of it all
limiting
is like
factor.
for me to then say to the guy, and I mean, I have like ample stories that I'm perfectly willing to tell you, but to have the talk, which is like this dreaded reality that anybody under like any 30 here knows exactly what I'm talking about. Of what are we talk?
I think anyone of any age knows what
Yeah,
you're
but-
talking about. That's a universal one. We got that one
But
checked.
what
Yeah.
happens at the reality of what happens at the end of it, though, is that it's something people dread because even though you have been, for all intents and purpose, exclusive for a series of weeks, once you finally talk about it and say, like, just to check in, like, we're exclusive, right? Which could be a host of reasons, maybe, like, primarily your sexual health, someone sleeping with someone else, that's usually the end of it. That's where the red flag of, I'm not ready for a relationship, I'm not ready for commitment, I can't marry you right now, all comes up.
Do you think so one of the things that you are concerned about is making sure that people are getting pleasure out of the sexual relationships they're having. And just to quickly bring in one piece of research, there's a big national study showing that they asked women about their experiences of hookup sex versus relationship sex. Basically the one night stand definition you're using. And for women, there is a significant decrease in terms of the rate of orgasm in the hookup encounter versus a relationship. So that seems like not such a great sign about what hookups are yielding for women. So in the pseudo-relationship world, which maybe is this blurry line in between, do you think that there is a similar problem of people not working on their sex lives in kind of a mutual way that would yield more pleasure and fulfillment of desire?
Yeah, I mean, I think 100%. So I think that's what's perhaps most troubling about it is for the one night stand thing. I mean, sex I've found to be like, it's relational. It's about knowing somebody deeply. It's about, you know, like talking about how your body works. A one night stand doesn't surprise me. Like that statistic that people are having less orgasms, like I think we can probably all agree that that makes sense for most people. But what's seriously troubling is that I still found in almost all of my interviews people that are consistently having sex with one person throughout a series of weeks remain dissatisfied with the sexual experience itself. Of course, that's not everybody, but that's...
Is that true for, are we in like heteronormative land right
I'm in heteronormative land right now.
And so are we talking about men as well as women or just women?
I think that the men, I mean, it's just like for men, the mechanism of the whole thing is easier. I mean, like, I think many men that I spoke to were dissatisfied in that the connection, if it were there emotionally and, you know, like as humans, would make the experience better. But I think if we're talking orgasm rates, it's probably pretty similar for men, whereas it's drastically different for women.
Stephanie, is this your experience, this kind of reluctance to take that very like everything is happening on paper that would look like a relationship, but the what Esther called the like that last sort of connection is not happening? Is that what you...
100%. I think that it's actually, I think, very interesting because in terms of the friends I've talked to, kind of the experiences that kind of I've seen, the woman is always the one who's like, but I don't want to bring it up. Like, I don't want to seem too pushy. I don't want to like force him like
that's the
into a relationship
stereotype,
because
right?
That's a stereotype. And like, obviously, we're still kind of in a heteronormative kind of conversation right now. But I think the thing that is really difficult is like a real sense of insecurity that comes with that I think women in college, they're struggling with insecurities. I mean, men are too, all across the board. And then there's a real sense of, I don't want him to like think badly of me because I want to like keep our relationship strong and I have like feel like I'm growing an emotional connection, but I don't see it and it's difficult and it ends in most cases that I've seen really badly. It's like I feel like I've seen a lot of heartbreak. It is genuine heartbreak because the girl thinks, and this is just my experience, and there's many of them out there that, you know, the woman is like, this is going further than it is, and it hasn't been their experience. And I think there's just a sense of, I can't go there.
You know, it's funny, I'm listening to you guys and I'm hearing it almost weirdly as simultaneously transgressive and very romantic, and I don't really know, like I'm gonna read something you wrote. We were desperate to know what it felt like to be wanted, desperate for a chance at intimacy, desperate for a hand held in daylight, for public affirmation of desire typically expressed only after too many drinks, desperate to try commitment and then decide if it wasn't working rather than being prematurely cut off from it. Like, in our era, we weirdly read that as anti-feminist or something.
100%, and I read it as anti-feminist too. at the time, I think this construct that I personally had developed was, I ought to enjoy this setup. It's what the feminist women that came before me provided me the liberation to be able to engage this way. Ultimately, it's completely ridiculous and hypocritical, because what's feminist is to do what you want and to express your desires and to have the respect and the commitment within the person you're having sex with to have the space to discuss that. But what I wrote there, and I think it's difficult to read it on paper because it seems so absurd. It seems like, why does this super educated, like well-accomplished young girl just say
And
to the
feminist.
guy,
too,
feminist woman just be like, yo, I like you. And honestly, I did do that, and I was beaten down throughout my college experience, to be quite honest. It wasn't like the tragedy of the world, and people had much worse experience than I, but when I put myself out there, it was just repetition time and again of, the script of, you're too good for me, I can't commit into a relationship right now, I just can't do it. And it leaves you in that state of desperation. And the reality is, this internal monologue, which drove me to do the thesis, is what was circling through hundreds of women's minds. What was liberating is hearing that affirmation that you're not alone, but it's all the more troubling at the amplitude. And through that Quartz article, hearing hundreds of responses from students nationwide as well as globally saying, this is my experience and I don't know what to do about it.
Stephanie, can you speak to the men? So there is a script being written in college. It's not working for the women. I think, now we're all thinking, oh, but it's awesome for the guys, but maybe it's not awesome for the guys. Can you talk about that?
I'm not a guy, so I don't have that experience from that perspective, but my male friends are just as insecure about the situation as my female friends. And what has actually been really fascinating for me is seeing two friends kind of enter a pseudo relationship and both of them come and be like, I'm really insecure about the situation. Should I talk to her about it? Should I not talk to her about it? And this goes beyond heteronormative relationships as well. Maybe it's just this age where it's I don't know what I want and I'm confused and there's a lot of things around me, but I think there's also a pressure on men, particularly in college, to do checks on the bedpost. I think that's something that's a phrase that kind of was thrown around, I'm gonna be masculine and sleep around, and that's actually still something that is a problem. And I think many of my male friends, they felt also pressured into a hookup culture, which requires them to maybe be more sexual more quickly than they actually want it to be, or more sexual with more people than they want it to be, or I have to initiate this conversation, or I have to be the one to drive anything that's going on, and I think it's very confusing.
One thing that strikes me, thinking about what Esther said about monogamy and the challenges that it presents, this ideal we have now of this very long period in which we're only having sex with one person. You guys are in you're on the other side of the coin, or you're coming out of a world in which the expectations are completely flipped. And I wonder if there's a relationship there between, funny word to use, there's a connection there between these two very different sets of expectations, that there's this emerging adulthood phase that you're in and have been coming out of this particular 4-year part of, in which you're supposed to have sex with everyone, or at least many people don't actually want to do that, but there's that idea. And then you have this incredibly long period of only getting to do it with one person. And maybe there's a way in which those two extremes are fighting with each other.
I think absolutely. Yeah.
Cognitive dissonance of the college experience, and then I graduated. I've been out of college for a year now. That first year out, I think is just so people just don't know what to do with themselves, because now it's entering that kind of emerging adulthood age where people start to think, oh, maybe I should be in a relationship, or I'm living in a city, I'm not surrounded by people 24/7, I'm working 14 hours a day, I just want to come home to someone. And then I've had so many of my guy friends come up to me after they've graduated and been like, I just totally messed up. At Middlebury, there was so many amazing people, and now all I wish is that I could meet those people again. And I think there ought to be just we could make it more of a gray line instead of a black-white empty space.
Right.
What is also interesting is as someone who really didn't want to enter the hookup culture, kind of coming in, it was strange. It was like that was a weird thing. Like
There are lots.
What do you mean you're an outlier?
yeah,
Right? I
there
feel
are
like
lots
it's
of people.
important to say that.
Yeah, and it is important to say that. And like I include myself as one of them, and I think that what was strange was like realizing that that was actually okay, and that there were a lot more people out there that didn't want to do
It's
it.
actually probably the majority. At
Yeah,
least,
I would
right?
say it is.
Yeah.
I think it's the vast majority that don't want to be engaging it. There's
And-
also a majority that just don't, but it's the vast majority that don't want.
There's a difference between not wanting to and not doing it, and not wanting to and still doing it. And so like that I think is a very interesting distinction, and not something that you know, is something that has a lot of research on it yet, but.
Can I ask you guys about why? I mean, you are the age that you are and you had the experience that you had, but there is something curious looking from the outside, like why is it that you come to college and you crash into this thing that's socially normed but which nobody is really prepared for? One theory, which we have batted around before, is that kids are so protected now and so tied to their parents, and then suddenly they walk in, much less than we were when we were in high school, much less sort of allowance for experimenting, and then suddenly you walk into college and you're expected to know things that you have had no experience with and don't know.
Yeah, I think there's that. I also think, especially at like the schools that we went to, there's going to college and like maybe you knew everything in high school, and then you get there and like you don't know anything, and people are telling you that you're like maybe failing for the first time, and so you're looking for any kind of satisfaction, any kind of reciprocation where someone will tell you like, yeah, like this is good, like you're good. And so, you know, if like that idea that, you know, if somebody comes up to you at a party and says like, oh, like I'm interested, it's like, well, my professors aren't interested in me right now, like my college street mates are like driving me crazy, like maybe there's a part of it that's just like this is new, and actually somebody maybe is paying attention to me in a different way than before.
Can we bring drinking into the conversation?
Yeah.
Because certainly our adult fears of watching this period of life is that you guys, not you personally, your world is using alcohol as a kind of social lubricant in a way that's beyond, that is a binge kind of scary way, not a like one or two beers helpful way.
Yeah.
Are we overly worried about that as grown-ups, or is that something that you guys saw and found alarming at school?
I think it's like, it's hard to generalize on that front. I think what I found particularly alarming were people that had no experience or were restricted from drinking all throughout high school and then came to college and really crashed in a hard way on alcohol, or people that had very little. I went to public school in high school and was exposed to like partying and drinking, and people started having sex in like 8th grade, and that's not a good thing necessarily, but I was not surprised by anything I saw when I went to Middlebury, whereas some of my peers, I did not realize that they were entering on a completely different level, and they're all at once, and the many women that I interviewed reported this, being exposed in the first week, first time being drunk, first time being at a party, first time being hit on by boys, first time being hit on by girls, and you know, they just have no idea what to do with it, and it kind of felt, many people described freshman year as like a tornado, that their lives just like spun out of control, and that things, social life and sex was happening to them rather than that they were choosing to engage with it. I personally didn't so much experience that, and I feel grateful that I had the high school experience I did, but I think what parents ought to be more worried about, this is just me, Leah's personal opinion, is protecting their children so hawkishly that when they enter college, they are completely raw, and they also don't have that support network and parents to come back to if there's something goes wrong, because what they come back to is the dorm, where it's inescapable, continuous pressure.
And you haven't even had time to establish the kinds of friendships that would help you through. And we know
yeah.
college administrators call that first week, 6 weeks of school, the red zone, because the danger of sexual assault is higher during that time.
And as someone, like I grew up in the UK where the drinking age is 18 and not 21. And so what was interesting for me, kind of comparing my college experience with like my friends, was like, they were going out to bars freshman year of college, right? That's legal, it's like a normal thing to do. And so in some ways and not in others, there was a outside protection, like the police are around. Like a bartender's not gonna serve you if you're like really, really drunk, and hopefully in most cases, but
And where were you guys going to drink
frat parties, right,
Also,
right.
like when you're underage, it's just like drink as many shots as possible before you go out because you can't have anything once you get out.
And this is like the French win, honestly. Like our drinking age is
Or
ridiculous.
even our
yeah.
previous generation. So at Yale, where you've been, a frequent refrain among alumni who are now on the faculty is, hey, when I was here, we could drink in the dining hall. It was part of the college social scene in a way that was with the lights on, without, the fraternity brothers being in charge and having control over this space. That's a loss. Whereas now, what I see, or at least hear about in the first, especially the beginning of school, are these huge lines outside fraternities to get into these particular spaces, which are the only places where the freshmen can drink. And that sets up a power dynamic where you have these younger girls, older guys. It's fraught.
Yeah, and then it comes with, as many people didn't have like a social experience with with drinking in high school, maybe some people's like parents didn't even like introduce like what alcohol is to them, and like maybe some of the dangers of alcohol.
There's
maybe
no
there are
concept of even limits.
like, my high school taught me kind of like, in science class, like what alcohol can do to you, but not everybody has that education, and I think that's something that can be difficult. Is like, you go through orientation where they tell you not to drink, but like nobody like listens to it for the most part, which is unfortunate because it's important. And there are students that I have seen, like, especially as someone older in the school, who don't even realize that drinking X amount of like shots or taking particular drugs, even if we're getting into that, like that's an issue. And I think that it just like leads to like guards being let down, people already feeling insecure, they don't know what they want, someone offers to walk them home because they don't know where they are and they're drunk and they are kind of a little bit out of it, and then we lead to kind of ambiguity and a lot of other problems which come with that. So the thing that I mean, you made a recommendation, the thing that I would recommend is like having a very open and honest conversation, like with your kids or siblings or like friends about, what are these things? Like, what could harm me? Like, just like being open and frank about it. And I think actually the people that I've seen who had those kind of conversations before coming to college were actually much more moderate in their drinking and everything because they, felt like they could openly talk about it with parents, teachers, etc.
Well, on that positive note of advice, Leah, Stephanie, Emily, thank you so much. You guys have been a really fun audience. Thank you a lot.